Welcome to the Deep Dive. Today is going to be a wild ride. We're tackling, well, basically all of philosophy.
Huh. Yeah, someone's got ambitious taste. You're sure you're up for a whirlwind tour through the greatest hits?
Absolutely. I mean, where else do you even start with a lineup this good? We're talking Socrates, Simone de Beauvoir, even delving into some philosophy of law.
Love the enthusiasm. Makes my job easy. So to make sure we actually cover some ground, we'll be hitting the highlights of each thinker. Think of it like a tasting menu of philosophy, a little something to pique your curiosity.
Okay, I'm starving for some brain food. Let's do this. And what better place to begin than ancient Greece, with the OG philosopher himself, Socrates, the godfather of, well, questioning everything. It's kind of wild, though. The guy never actually wrote anything down.
Right, talk about an influencer. Everything we know about Socrates, all those zingers, those thought experiments, they come filtered through his student, Plato. But hey, those Platonic dialogues are classics for a reason. Justice, truth, the good life, it's all there.
And then there's Plato's student, Aristotle. This guy was like the ultimate polymath, right? Didn't he literally write about everything?
Basically, we're talking logic, ethics, politics.
Yeah.
Aristotle was laying down the foundations for, like, Western thought as we know it.
It's kind of intimidating, actually. But hey, it wasn't all serious contemplation back then, was it? We got to talk about Epicurus. Now, he's the one known for indulging in a little pleasure.
Ah, Epicurus. People hear Epicurean and think, like, all-night parties and endless feasts. But honestly, that's a bit of a misconception.
Really, I always thought he was all about, if it feels good, do it.
Not quite. Epicurus was more about living a life free from pain and fear, finding that sweet spot of serenity. Sure, pleasure was part of the equation, but for him, it was about simple pleasures. A good conversation, friendship, appreciating beauty. Those were his jam.
See, this is why I love these deep dives. Busting myths, left and right. Okay, let's jump ahead a few centuries to the Middle Ages, where we get this fascinating fusion of, well, faith and reason. Augustine of Hippo, for example. His work's everywhere.
No kidding. Augustine was wrestling with some seriously heavy questions. We're talking about the nature of God, the mystery of time, free will versus predestination. He was grappling with these huge concepts.
And he was doing it at a time when, religion was pretty much the dominant force.
Exactly. And what's so cool about Augustine is that he didn't see faith and reason as being at odds with each other. He actually used philosophical inquiry to try and understand and explain his theological beliefs.
It's like he was way ahead of his time.
And what about Thomas Aquinas? He's the one with that massive book, right? What was it called again?
The Summa Theologica. Don't worry, most people haven't actually read the whole thing. It's a bit of a beast. But Aquinas was another one trying to build bridges between faith and reason. He wanted to show that you could arrive at religious truths through logic and philosophical investigation. I'm sensing a theme here. Okay, we also have a few, maybe slightly lesser-known names from the Middle Ages on the list. Boethius, Maimonides, and Anselm of Canterbury. What were their big contributions?
Well, Boethius, he was a bit of a tragic figure, actually. Imprisoned unjustly, he finds solace in what else? Philosophy. He wrote the Consolation of Philosophy, exploring fate, free will, all while stuck in prison. Talk about making the most of a bad situation.
Wow, that's dedication. What about the others?
Right, so Maimonides, he was a Jewish scholar doing some serious heavy lifting, trying to reconcile the philosophical powerhouse that is Aristotle with Jewish thought.
Yeah.
And then there's Anselm, who gave us the ontological argument for the existence of God.
I've heard of that. Isn't that the one that tries to prove God's existence through logic alone?
That's the one. It sparked centuries of debate, let me tell you.
Okay, ready to hit fast forward on the philosophical timeline. We're entering the modern era, and it kicks off with a bang, courtesy of René Descartes and that famous declaration, "I think, therefore I am." I mean, that's got to be one of the most recognizable philosophical quotes of all time. Did he know he was dropping a philosophical truth bomb when he wrote that?
Honestly, probably. Descartes was all about finding a solid foundation for knowledge, something you could be absolutely certain of. And he realized, even if you doubt everything else, your senses, the world around you, the very act of doubting means you, as a thinking thing, must exist. It's a real mic drop moment in the history of thought.
No kidding. Okay, so after Descartes shakes things up, we've got Spinoza questioning traditional views on God and nature, definitely a bold move for the time. And then Locke enters the scene, emphasizing individual rights, which had a huge impact on modern democracy. And we haven't even gotten to Hume, Kant, Berkeley, or Rousseau yet. I'm starting to see why they call it a deep dive.
And we're just getting warmed up. All right, next up is David Hume, a Scottish philosopher who wasn't afraid to challenge pretty much everything. Hume was all about empiricism, the idea that knowledge comes from experience. He asked some really tough questions about things we take for granted, like cause and effect.
Yeah, like how do we really know that one thing causes another?
Exactly. Is it just that we're used to seeing them happen together? Or is there some deeper connection? Hume really made people rethink the basis of their knowledge.
Talk about a mind workout. And then there's Kant, who I'll admit always intimidates me a little.
Kant. He's definitely not known for being easy reading.
Hmm.
But he was trying to bridge this gap between rationalism, the idea that reason is the source of knowledge, and empiricism, which we were just talking about with Hume.
So kind of finding a middle ground.
You could say that. Kant believed that both reason and experience play a role in how we understand the world. His philosophy is incredibly complex, but his ideas about morality, the nature of reality, they're still hugely influential today. Oh, and speaking of influential, we can't forget Rousseau. This guy was a giant of the Enlightenment. He's all about the social contract, the idea that government derives its power from the consent of the governed.
Which is like the cornerstone of modern democracy.
Exactly. Rousseau believed that humans are inherently good, but corrupted by society. He argued for a more just and equitable social order.
It's amazing how many of these ideas still resonate today. Okay, on to the 18th and 19th centuries, where we encounter even more philosophical heavyweights. We've got Leibniz, Hobbes, and Bacon, each with their own unique take on the world.
Yeah, it was like the philosophical all-star team decided to show up at once. Take Gottfried Wilhelm Leibniz, for example. Talk about a Renaissance man. He developed calculus independently of Newton, proposed this wild theory of monads, which are basically these tiny fundamental units of reality.
So he was like a mathematician and a philosopher. That's just showing off.
Right. And then there's Thomas Hobbes, who saw the world as a pretty brutal place. He lived through some rough times, like the English Civil War, and he believes that human nature was basically selfish and power-hungry.
So kind of the opposite of Rousseau then.
Yeah, you could say that. Hobbes argued that we need a strong sovereign, a leviathan to keep everyone in check and prevent chaos. And then there's Francis Bacon, who's all about science. He championed the scientific method, emphasizing observation, experimentation. Basically, he was a major force in the scientific revolution.
Okay, I gotta admit, this whirlwind tour is making my head spin a little, and we're not done yet. The 19th century brings us Hegel, Schopenhauer, Mill, and of course, you can't forget Nietzsche.
Buckle up, because we're entering the age of isms. You've got Hegel with his absolute idealism, this vast, intricate system of thought that's notoriously difficult to grasp.
Yeah, I've tried tackling Hegel. It's intense.
It definitely keeps you on your toes. But then you have Schopenhauer, who was way less optimistic about, well, everything. He believed that life is essentially suffering, driven by this blind, irrational will. Kind of a downer, but hey, he makes some interesting points.
I'm sensing some existential angst creeping in here. But didn't John Stuart Mill try to bring back a little optimism?
Totally. Mill was all about individual liberty, social reform, and his big thing, utilitarianism, the greatest happiness for the greatest number of people.
Utilitarianism always seems to spark a debate, though. Is it really possible to calculate happiness like that?
Right. There are definitely some tricky ethical dilemmas that come up. And then, of course, there's Nietzsche, the ultimate philosophical rebel. He challenged pretty much everything, morality, religion, even the way we think about truth. He's the one who famously declared God is dead.
Talk about a statement. Okay, so the 19th century was a lot to process, but here we are in the 20th century with some familiar names. Wittgenstein, Sartre, de Beauvoir. These are the philosophers I actually read in college. What kind of impact did they have?
Well, the 20th century was a time of incredible upheaval, right? Wars, technological advancements, social revolutions. Philosophy had to grapple with all of that. Take Wittgenstein, for example. He completely changed the way we think about language. He argued that meaning isn't inherent in words themselves, but comes from how we use them in different situations. It's a bit mind-bending, but it has huge implications for how we understand communication, knowledge, everything.
It's like our whole understanding of the world shifted yet again. And then you've got Sartre and de Beauvoir, the power couple of existentialism. They were all about freedom, responsibility, the search for meaning in a world that often seems absurd.
Exactly. Sartre famously said, man is condemned to be free, which kind of sums up the existentialist viewpoint. We're thrown into this world without a predetermined purpose, and it's up to us to create meaning in our lives. And de Beauvoir took those ideas and applied them specifically to the experience of being a woman in a patriarchal society.
Which is so important. Okay, so far we've jumped from ancient Greece to the 20th century, and it looks like we're wrapping up this philosophical marathon with a special focus on philosophy of law. What inspired this addition to our already jam-packed itinerary?
Well, you know how much I love seeing how these big abstract ideas actually play out in the real world. And what better example than the law? I mean, legal systems are basically attempts to create a just and ordered society, but the philosophical foundations of what that even means, well, that's where things get really interesting.
Okay, so walk us through it. Who are the legal MVPs we need to know?
Well, we've got to start with Jeremy Bentham, the father of utilitarianism. Remember that idea of the greatest happiness for the greatest number? Bentham believed that principles should be applied to law.
So laws should be designed to maximize happiness and minimize suffering.
Exactly. It seems intuitive, but it gets complicated fast. Like, what about individual rights? What if punishing one innocent person somehow led to greater happiness overall? These are the kinds of dilemmas utilitarianism grapples with.
Those are some tough questions. I'm already feeling the philosophical gears turning. Who else is on our legal lineup?
Well, there's H.L.A. Hart, a legal positivist who argued that law and morality are separate systems. For Hart, laws are simply rules that have been established through a particular process. They don't have to be morally good to be valid.
So following the law doesn't necessarily mean doing what's morally right. That's a thought-provoking distinction.
Exactly. And it raises a lot of questions about civil disobedience, unjust laws, all of that. Then there's Ronald Workin, who was all about the idea of law as integrity. He believed that law isn't just a bunch of rules, but a coherent system of principles that needs to be interpreted in a way that makes sense as a whole.
So like finding the story that connects all the legal dots.
Exactly. And then there's Hans Kelsen, who developed this thing called the pure theory of law, which focused on the structure of legal systems, how norms are created, validated, and related to each other.
Hmm.
Oh, and we can't forget Lon Fuller, who really emphasized the importance of procedure. He believed that even an unjust law still needs to follow certain basic procedures to be considered a law at all. Otherwise, it's just, brute force.
Wow, who knew there were so many different ways to think about the law? We've only got a few minutes left, but I see a few more names on the list. Finnis, Nozick, Nagel, Holmes, and McKinnon. Can you give us a very quick rundown of their contributions?
Absolutely. John Finnis, he's a modern natural law theorist, meaning he believes there's a connection between law and objective morality. Robert Nozick, he's a libertarian who argued for minimal government and strong individual rights. Thomas Nagel, he's known for his work on moral luck. The idea that things outside of our control can affect how we judge people morally.
It's like that old saying, right place, right time. Sometimes it really does seem like luck plays a role in life, even when it comes to morality.
For sure. And lastly, we have Oliver Wendell Holmes Jr., a famous Supreme Court justice who was also a legal realist. He emphasized the role of social context and practical considerations in how judges interpret the law.
So not just looking at the law in a vacuum, but really considering the real-world impact of legal decisions.
Exactly. And finally, we have Catherine McKinnon, who brought a much-needed feminist perspective to legal theory. She's challenged traditional assumptions about gender, power, and the law, advocating for women's rights, and exposing the ways in which legal systems can perpetuate inequality.
What an incredible journey. We've really covered some ground today, from ancient Greece all the way to the 20th century. We've only just scratched the surface of what these incredible thinkers had to say.
I know, right?
Yeah.
It's amazing to see how these ideas have evolved and interacted over time. And the really exciting thing is that the conversation isn't over. There's still so many unanswered questions, so many new ways to think about the world, and who knows what brilliant minds are out there right now, shaping the future of philosophy.
It makes you realize that philosophy isn't just some dusty old subject. It's a living, breathing thing. It's about engaging with the big questions, challenging our assumptions, and never stopping searching for deeper understanding.
Exactly. It's about curiosity,
Hmm.
about pushing the boundaries of thought, and honestly, it's something that anyone can participate in. You don't need a PhD in philosophy to grapple with these big ideas. It's all about being willing to ask questions and engage in the great conversation.
And on that note, we'll leave you to ponder the endless possibilities of philosophical inquiry. Until next time, keep those brain gears turning.